Welcome to Cincy Reformed Podcast. I'm Pastor Brandon, and I'm pastor of Christ Reformed Church in Northern Kentucky. I'm joined with Pastor Zac. He is pastor of Ascension Church, and we're actually in the building here of Ascension Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And today we wanted to do a podcast episode speaking about the upcoming synodical meeting that's going to take place in Escondido, California. And I thought maybe we would kick it off first because not all of our audience is perhaps aware of the Reformed Church and what the URC even is. So maybe Zac, before we jump into what's going to happen at Synod, we can talk just broadly about what in the world is the URC in the first place.
Yeah, so the United Reformed Churches in North America is the long name. It's often just called the URC for short, United Reformed Churches. And we're a relatively small denomination. Sometimes people prefer the word federation of 125-ish churches, about 15 church plants, about 140 churches. And those are divided into 8 different regions, which we call a classis. It's the equivalent of a diocese or a presbytery. Depends on what kind of language you're most familiar with. But within our denomination of about 140 worshiping bodies, there are about 25,000 members. And so again, we're not a very large group, but we are actually quite unified. And so that does make it a joyful time, and is something I look forward to every couple of years. But Brandon, how about tell people about what a synod is?
Yeah, so synod is our broadest assembly. And the synod happens at least once every 3 years, oftentimes every 2 years. We did have kind of a lag time there with COVID where we were not able to meet within that parameter. But typically every 2 years we've been meeting, and the way it works is every church in the URC will send 2 delegates to Synod. And those 2 delegates represent that church, and they go to Synod, and there will be various proposals and decisions made, and each delegate will vote on behalf of their congregation which direction that we ought to take on those votes. Beside the 2 delegates that every church sends to Synod, we're also joined by other pastors and elders of different denominations that we are in fraternal relation with. So, for example, we might have people visiting from the OPC or the PCA, and even denominations that are Reformed and Presbyterian around the world. So, Lithuania and New Zealand and Australia and so forth. We will have about over 200 delegates, maybe up to like 242 or something, delegates for 2024 Synod, but we'll more likely have over 300 people there in terms of visitors and fraternal delegates and spouses and so on. So Zac, maybe you can kind of go over, as we're meeting in Synod and we're going to be discussing different overtures and things, maybe you can talk about that agenda.
Yeah, so that's been on my to-do list for the last couple of weeks, reading, digesting about 320, 330 pages of the agenda, and it's pretty intensive. Reports that are coming in from the various committees who are responsible to Synod, or people who have a task given by Synod that they have to report back to Synod about how they did. For example, the stated clerk or the foreign missions coordinator. So those sorts of folks will report back in terms of how things have gone over the past couple of years, because they answer to Synod because they've been appointed by Synod for those kind of denomination-wide tasks. We also hear from committees who are responsible for just different actions in between. We hear from a home missions committee, a foreign missions committee, committees who are responsible for our ecumenical endeavors internationally and also within our country. There are study committee reports we'll talk about here in a little bit. And there are just various kinds of overtures. And an overture is just an action item that a local church has sent to the regional assembly, then the regional assembly sends up to the synod, and then that's acted upon. It's some sort of action that is desired by some that the entire denomination takes together in unity. And so there are various overtures that we'll talk about here in just a little bit. But again, various points of action, and maybe you can kind of talk about how that's handled, because we can't obviously read through 320 pages of material together on the floor of class of synod. So how do we handle that stuff?
Right. So during our time together, we not only meet as a giant body, and it's kind of neat to see that actually, as we're all together and all these delegates, and we're meeting pastors and elders from churches that are across the country, and people that we don't typically get to chat with. It's actually a really sweet time. But we also have breakout sessions and breakout committees that will handle smaller matters to kind of summarize things, bring those nuggets back to synod for deliberation and so forth. There'll be plenary sessions and other ways like that. Can you think of any other ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are how we really handle stuff. You know, the committees kind of handle more of the details and bring some digested thoughts, right?
Yeah.
That way we don't have to do all that work in the main body, because that's pretty unwieldy with 200 plus people.
That's right. Yeah. But you mentioned the study committees, and we every once in a while we will appoint a study committee to kind of tackle a certain area that needs some clarity. And perhaps churches want the federation as a whole to kind of speak into something, and so they'll appoint a study committee that will present then to synod. And this synodical meeting coming up, there are two interesting study committee reports, one on digital media and worship, and then one on human sexuality. So Zach, you maybe want to kind of explain those to us?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the request for the study committee on digital media and worship really arose, as you could probably guess, from the COVID and lockdown experience. Before that, I mean, there were surely some times where churches had some of their worship services online, perhaps, or they were maybe sending their worship services to a retirement home, or maybe to like a hospital or something along those lines, where people were unable to get out and go to a worship service. But then all of a sudden COVID had happened, and then questions began to arise along the lines of, how should we think about the worship service that is being then broadcast on the internet? Is it the exact same thing when somebody is sitting at home and observing the worship service from their living room or from their bedroom or whatever? Is that the same thing as when they gather in person for the worship service? And how should we think about the preaching of the word? How should we think about the ministry of the sacraments from somebody who's distant from the actual embodied assembly? And so then the study committee has reflected upon this, done a lot of reading on this, and then has brought some very helpful, I think, nuggets to bear in terms of how to begin to categorize these things and think about these things from a biblical and a faithfully reformed perspective. And so, again, we'll discuss that, and I don't want to give too much. I mean, I find a lot of their stuff to be helpful. I don't want to get too much into the weeds in terms of where I stand on the committee, because I want to hear the deliberations from others as well. But certainly there's a lot of helpful stuff in there. And similar thing with the human sexuality report. I think, again, for those who are committed to the Reformed confessions, I think they're going to find very little, if anything, objectionable in these two study committees. But it really, both of them, I think, clarify a lot in terms of how we can think biblically and confessionally about these matters. The human sexuality report, as you could imagine, is engaging with things like transgenderism. It's engaging with things like the gay Christian so-called language that's being used quite widely. How do we think about issues of identity? How do we think about use of pronouns? How do we think about the various movements and agendas that currently exist within our cultural moment, and how can we kind of cut through these things and begin to make sense of them from a biblical perspective. And one of the things I find really helpful about both of these committee reports is that they're really quite practical in terms of asking questions and answering questions about how do we kind of make sense of these matters in our day. So, yeah. Anything else you'd like to say on those?
No, I think that was helpful.
Right.
We can maybe jump into the overtures here. And I'll start with kind of looking at overture 3 and 8. So 3 and 8 are kind of getting at one issue, and they might be taking some different ways in which we could address it. But it has to deal with bringing Article 31 of the church order and Appendix 7 in a more harmonious way, like bringing them together in a more explicitly, I should say, harmonious way. Overture 3 wants to amend two things. Overture 3 wants to amend the Church Order 31 and Appendix 7, whereas Overture 8 only wants to amend the Appendix 7. And so what's the concern here? Why is there the concern of wanting to amend these things? Well, the concern is that Church Order 31 and Appendix 7 can be interpreted as being at odds with each other. Article 31 of the Church Order seems to suggest if an individual wants to appeal a decision of a broader assembly, that individual must first go through the consistory, his or her consistory, and then the consistory then brings that appeal to classis and then on to synod. Whereas Appendix 7, however, seems to suggest that an individual apart from the consistory can go directly to a broader assembly, classis, or synod. And so there's this tension here of, can an individual just go to a broader assembly, or must the individual go to his or her consistory to then appeal to the broader assemblies? And so Overture 3 wants to change, again, Church Order 31, to mandate that the individual appeal, and I quote, to the assembly whose decision is being appealed. And so it removes the language of the consistory, going to the consistory first. So Overture 3, removing the consistory language from Church Order 31. However, in Appendix 7, Overture 3 says the individual shall seek advice from his or her consistory, which would give the consistory opportunity to make the appeal. So it would give the consistory opportunity to say, okay, we'll take that on, we will make that appeal. So therefore, it gives that opportunity, but it also leaves room for the individual to just go ahead and make that appeal anyway, if the consistory doesn't want to take that up. That the individual could petition the consistory. If the consistory says no, then the individual could perhaps still go on to those broader assemblies via themselves. Overture 8, however, is taking a little bit of a different route in that Overture 8 wants to retain all the wording in Church Order 31. But it wants to make explicit in Appendix 7 that individuals can only appeal their consistory, and consistories then will appeal classis and so on. And so again, the individual must go through the consistory. The individual cannot skip their consistory and go straight to classis or straight to synod, but that there's a process by which to do that. So again, kind of dealing with the same issue here, but coming at it from perhaps a couple different directions. Anything you want to add on that?
No, I think that just the big thing that's at concern when we talk about appeals is matters of justice, and how do we ensure that justice is being done not merely to individuals, but to make sure that the churches in our denomination and the assemblies in our denomination are playing by the rules. And so if someone is perceived to be not playing by the rules, How then do you address that? Can an individual address that? Or does it have to come from a body of elders or a regional body of elders and ministers, that kind of a thing? And so that's really the quest going on there, is to figure out how do we make sure that justice is occurring and people are following what they've agreed to follow. And then how do you address that if something is perceived to be out of step? So the next overture we wanted to mention is Overture 5. And Overture 5 is a document that appeared at the last synod meeting, and it was tabled indefinitely. In other words, there was no positive or negative action taken to it. It was just set to the side, and it's being brought back now by one of the classes. And it is a document that relates to, that seeks to clarify the relationship between the church, the state, and then the family. This again is a bit of a matter that you could say comes out of the COVID experience that we've all lived. And then how do we think about the authority of the civil magistrate alongside the authority of the church and the authority of the family? I think there is a certain fear of tyranny that is well placed and well founded, as we saw through the various actions taken by the civil magistrate during the lockdowns. And so this document is seeking to address that and to clarify the authority that rests with the civil magistrate alongside the family and the church. And so within this overture, there are 9 different affirmations that serve as warnings to the state. And so there's an example here of affirmation 6, that the magistrate, under the penalty of forsaking its God-given office and falling into tyranny, should forbear assuming the right and power of the only King of the church, Jesus Christ. So that's a bit of an example of one of the affirmations there. Another helpful one is affirmation 9, that parents are free to educate and catechize their children without fear of persecution, reprisal, or the seizure of their children by the state. So these are our theological conclusions that this overture seeks to invite the Federation to reaffirm, state explicitly in a coherent, cogent document, to help guide our churches and our membership.
So perhaps another one we can talk about is overtures 6 and 11. And again, these two are taken together because they are after kind of the same thing here. And the concern is, well, it starts actually out with a very positive thing, and that is God is building up the URC, and we have more and more people and more churches and more classes, and it's a great thing from where we were in 1996 to where the URC is in 2024. So it's great in what God is doing, but that does create then strain on the synodical meetings. So as we meet, again, we mentioned that there's going to be close to 250 delegates. We're going to have with fraternal delegates and guests, we might have over 300 people. And that is just from a logistical standpoint, very cumbersome. Thinking about where can we meet? Most of our churches could not hold all of those people, and so we need to think about renting out venues. I know one year we rented out a convention center, and so that becomes very costly to rent out a convention center, and then for all of these churches to fund plane tickets, and then you have to fund hotel costs for a whole week and meals. And if you're an elder, you might have to take off work for a whole week. And so just from a logistical standpoint, we're kind of running into this, what do we do? And even as we get together and there's 240 something delegates, it's hard for us all to really speak. But that also has a potential of silencing people who might want to deliberate a matter. We just don't have the time because there's so many people. And so that's kind of the concern. So the proposal is, instead of having every church send 2 delegates to synod, instead the classes would actually send 6 ministers and 6 elders from the classes to synod, which would result in about 96 delegates at synod, a much lower number from nearly 250 and growing. So, and that's kind of the proposal. And Overture 6 and Overture 11 are nearly identical. But I would say that Overture 11, as you read it, they would like to bring, I think, consistories into view, because there is that concern where you don't want the same kind of voices in classis or something where a church might feel left out or something like that. And so I think Overture 11 has that spirit in it where it wants to bring consistories of individual churches into clearer view. So, for example, according to Overture 11, the procedure would read, each classis shall delegate 6 ministers and 6 elders from consistories in the classes to synod. Whereas Overture 6 didn't have that language. Overture 6 just said each classis shall delegate 6 ministers and 6 elders to synod. Whereas Overture 11 is bringing into view that it's the consistories that are sending delegates itself to classis. And so we want to make sure that classis, for example, is making sure that the churches are regularly represented. And it's kind of bringing that into view in Overture 11. Overture 6, however, I would say, reading through that overture, it has more of a historical eye, which is interesting. For example, in Ground 14, as to why we ought to adopt this overture, it speaks about the historic practices of Dort and the church order at Dort, where classis did indeed delegate synod, not the individual churches. And it also mentions that as the URC was forming, there was concern that that somehow synod could be weaponized in a way against churches. And it was a reaction against what many felt the CRC was doing to those conservative and faithful ministers and consistories, and they wanted to ensure that that wouldn't happen again. And so one of the things that the first synod of the URC did was to make sure that every church is delegating synod. But as the Overture 6 makes clear, that concern really isn't apropos in the URC, especially nowadays. So anything to add on those overtures?
I don't think so. I think that was great. Next one we wanted to mention is Overture 9, and that is one pertaining to a new position in the synod being proposed, and that is coming from our own classis, actually, to establish a position of home missions clerk. And so the idea here is that while there is a coordinator who's working on the foreign missions field and helping to coordinate and really bring together those works that can require a lot more, just a lot more support given the international nature of those. Here within the domestic missions, the home missions, you don't need quite so much synodical support because our own classes, our regional assemblies are there, they're involved, they're engaged. We have committees regionally to help those, and we have more, there are coordinators being appointed in regional capacities. And so then the question becomes, well then, is there a way that the synod can also support things? And the solution here is not to go with a synodical home missions coordinator, but rather to go with a synodical home missions clerk. It might sound like a distinction without a difference, but really this is a secretary, somebody who will be just assisting the synodical committee and just working on documentation like the prayer maps, like the newsletters, not necessarily traveling around anywhere, but just helping the synodical committee that has a lot on their plates to accomplish the tasks that are given to them, to do a little bit in terms of website management to make sure that there is updates there. Oh yeah, this is definitely a part-time position, yes. About 5 hours per week. So, but yeah, that'll be an interesting one, Overture 9 for a home missions clerk.
Yeah.
So
I'm kind of moving on, I guess, from looking at the overtures. There are a couple proposed study committees. So again, we're receiving some study committees on like human sexuality and digital worship and all of that. But we're going to also propose that some other study committees be assembled by the synodical meeting. And one of those is coming from Overture 1. And the concern here is that some churches have voted to issue a call to a person, to a man, before he has graduated from seminary, perhaps. Or to have what some call a provisional call. Of, we'll call you, we want you here in our church, but they haven't yet been examined. And so there's this study committee that's being proposed to kind of deal with this kind of thing. And so the proposal is to form a study committee as to how the Federation can be united in dealing with pastoral vacancies in a way that aligns us with our confessions, with our church order. How can we be united in thinking about, hey, we have a vacancy, we need a minister of the word. How should we do that? Is it appropriate to have a provisional call or reach out to somebody who has yet to graduate from seminary? These kinds of things. And so that's going to be an interesting study committee, I think. Is there another one?
Yeah. Last one, in terms of the proposed study committees, is one that pertains to a building loan fund. The idea here is that there is currently no assistance being given at a denominational level when a congregation is seeking to purchase its first building, or maybe needs to create an addition to their current building. The traditional sources of loans no longer are interested in lending to churches, and if they do, the rates are completely exorbitant. And so it's really causing mission works, and we've experienced this here in Cincinnati, to struggle to find the kind of funding that's needed to purchase a first building and to find a church home for that mission work, when the traditional lending agencies won't even touch you and there's nothing denominationally. And so this study committee would be formed to figure out how can we do this as a federation, because we do straddle the Canadian border, and so there might have to be two different funds, one in Canada, one in the United States. We don't know. The study committee would figure that out. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church has a very successful building loan fund, and can we utilize their help in establishing one for ourselves? And what would be the kind of parameters that would be observed in terms of ensuring that there's no abuse of such a fund? How would the fund be built up with contributors and donors? What kind of rates would they be, interest rates would they receive back and for their investments? And those kinds of things. What structures would be in place? And so this study committee would examine those things and then bring back, presumably in 2 years' time at the next synod meeting in 2026, a proposal for how we as a federation can then begin to assist mission works and assist our current churches with a fund that would help us to have brick and mortar buildings within which discipleship can occur and the gospel can go forward. So anything else on that one, or anything else we want to discuss here, Brandon?
No, I mean, there's a whole host of edits that are being proposed in the church order, but again, there's so many of them are minor, and it's word choices. And, there was one overture that's bringing in actually a whole bunch of proposed edits to the church order. And it noted that a lot of these happened because, over the years, we might have tweaked or added things, but maybe not harmonized as much. And so this just kind of seeks to bring order in terms of the language that we use, to make it consistent front to back in the church order. So I think at first you're like, oh man, there's a lot of proposed changes here, but a lot of them are semantics or helping us do things like, for example, there's one regarding baptized members and wanting to see baptized members as full members in the congregation, not sub-members. Now, obviously, they don't have full communion privileges until they're communicant members, but yet they are no less members of our churches. And so there's things like that. And so we'll be deliberating those matters. But anything else?
No, I don't think so. But hopefully once Synod is finished up, then we can get back together and record another episode in terms of what happened at Synod. what kinds of decisions were made. And if I don't expect any controversy, but if there was, we can talk about that too. That'd be a lot of fun. But it seems to me like this is going to be a pretty smooth one, and that doesn't seem like there are any massively hot button issues going on. So, but yeah, perhaps get back with you guys. And after this, the week is over. It's June 17th to the 21st in Escondido, California. Do be in prayer for the URC, pray for the delegates, and pray that the peace and purity of the churches is promoted, and that decisions we make also further the spread of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So this has been the Cincy Reformed Podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. Signing off for Brandon, I'm Zach. Thanks so much. See you next week. Bye-bye.